Here's a question from Ryan Wilson, who I had the great pleasure of meeting also at the Catholic Imagination Conference. Um, he said, "You were the founder of the Pittsburgh International Poetry Forum and managed it for decades, bringing many or most of the great writers of at least two generations to your hometown. What was your goal when you established the forum? How did managing it affect your thinking about poetry? And do any of the forum's guests especially stand out in your memory, and why?"
Well, let's start with the title. I wanted it to be called a forum, not a center. It was a place where poets would be invited to come to appear on stage and to recite their poems to people who paid to hear them. That was the concept. Well, the first night we had Archibald MacLeish in the rain.
Wow.
The theater seated about 600 people. We turned away over 300 people in the rain.
Wow.
Then 2 months after that, we had the Russian. In fact, we were the ones who made possible Yevtushenko's coming to the United States because we, as the International Poetry Forum, invited him. Well, he came and they appeared in New York and all over the country, became world famous. But his first reading was in Pittsburgh at the International Poetry Forum. And then we continued. We had Nobel awardees, we had Pulitzer Prize winners, we had National Award winners, we had poets from 38 different countries. 38 different countries in 43 years.
Wow.
And I think it was a unique achievement, and I'm grateful to the people of Pittsburgh for supporting it. I'll always be grateful for that. They were terrific.
So Mike actually had a question about this as well. Mike, who's sitting off screen there, he wanted to know why international and not simply American. He wanted to know, what can Americans learn from poetry in other lands and languages?
Well, I think poetry is by definition international. By definition, I mean it's universal, or it's not poetry at all. One of the problems that, and I'm being frank here, one of the problems I have with many American poets now is that they don't transcend their circumstances. They just don't. I mean, they either write for one another or for journals of their choosing. They write. There's one poet named Ashbery who's since died, whose poets, in my view, poems just defy credence, and yet he's won every award imaginable. There's too much of a gang mentality about modern American poets, and foreign poets like Yevtushenko, like George Safaris when he was living, like Seamus Heaney, who came to the Poetry Forum 3 times. The first time, nobody knew who he was. Nobody.
Wow.
Czeslaw Milosz, first time he came, nobody knew who he was. After he won the Nobel Prize, I invited him back. He said, "I will come because you invite me before I receive the Nobel."
Wow, that's fantastic. So you found that foreign poets, even today, kind of resist some of the more insular, kind of confessional, identity group kind of and academic trends in modern American poetry?
Well, I can't say this, totally, but there are many poets in other languages which I read in translation, and they're as real to me as if they were speaking to me in English across the table. And that's the great gift that poetry has. I mean, it transcends, in a way, it transcends the language in which it is written.
So when Milosz came, was he reading translations of his own poems into English, or?
Yes, he cooperated with Edmund Keeley in, or no, I'm sorry, yeah, I have a mistaken. He and Robert Hass translated many of his poems, book after book, and he read the translations. He didn't read in Polish.
I see. One of the recurring themes whenever I've interviewed poets on this podcast, in particular, Dana Gioia, James Matthew Wilson, you, and a couple of others, has been the importance of hearing poetry read aloud, which obviously was central to the International Poetry Forum. And this was honestly my doorway into poetry. I discovered another podcast called The Daily Poem, hosted by David Kern, and he just 5 days a week he reads a poem and he comments on it for like 2 minutes and then reads it again, and that's it. And it's very well curated. And just listening to a few of those completely changed. I've said this many times on the podcast, but it completely changed my relationship with poetry from something that I was intimidated by and felt that I didn't understand it correctly when I was reading it. I was afraid that I was missing something, and more something that I simply experienced in the moment as it was coming at me. And so I'm curious if that lines up with your sense of the importance of having people hear poetry rather than just reading it off a page.
Absolutely. I mean, poetry began before the printing press. Poetry was
Right.
spoken, and um, one of the liabilities of much modern poetry readings is that they're readings. I mean, a real poem should be heard as if it were a hearing, with no notes and no books, just the man or the woman reciting by heart what came from his or her heart.
Yeah.
So there's no interference. And that's, you find that among foreign poets, some, but it's not common in America. It's not common. You see somebody reading from a text as if you're reading from a phone book. There's almost no feeling in it at all. I once wrote a very short 4-line poem. I'll say it, and it says everything that I want to say about poetry recitals. Since eyes are deaf and ears are blind to words in all their ways, I speak the sounds I write, hoping you see what somehow stays unheard, and hear what never is quite clear at sight.